See, is this thing going? Okay. Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Well, if you've seen from all my latest videos, you'll know that I am actually getting used to using this video camera of mine. And I do mean the legit video camera you saw in the short. And as I said, I've had this thing for a couple of years, but I could never figure out how the hell to get the videos off of it until now. So you're probably wondering why I have Viking sword and longsword. Well, I'm actually going to do a quick little comparing and contrasting between these two. Why they are the way they are and how they handle. First up is the Viking sword. Now, the Viking sword comes from the 10th to 13th century Europe. It was predominantly used in one hand in adjacent with a large round shield. And I believe the round shield could either be center gripped or could be side gripped like so. I don't know, there's a lot of... I know predominantly Viking shields were center grip. But yes, they would be used in conjunction with a center grip shield, which I don't have a analog for at the moment. Making them essentially the perfect shield and sword combo for the time. Now, what is the Viking sword's biggest benefit? Well, it's actually its chopping power. See, a Viking sword, unlike an arming sword, has a blade that stays relatively the same width all the way down. Now, historically, I'm not as knowledgeable about European swords in general, but I believe historically Viking swords did not tend to have a lot of distal taper, simply because of the poor steel quality of the time period. Now, keep in mind, that does not mean that European steel quality was bad. It was better than most steel made at the time, say for like China and Japan and Korea, who had long swords measuring into the realms of Zweihander sized that were actually used in battle 2,000 years before this sword was even created by European hands. It's just that at the time, the 10th to 13th century, where the Viking sword was most prominently used, and one-handed arming swords in general, it's just the steel quality was not as good as it would be later on, where they could afford to lighten the blades. The blades had to be relatively stout and heavy in this time period because of the poor quality steel, which lent them to very heavy chopping blades, or at least heavier chopping blades. Now, the advantage of the Viking sword in its design is that it actually facilitates both powerful cuts, it facilitates powerful chops, and it can also thrust. So if anyone ever tells you that the Viking sword is not nimble, they're lying to you. It's not as nimble as, say, a rapier or a John, but it is nimble for its size. At least this cold steel rendition. In my hand, at least, I find it somewhat lively and nimble. Now, how were these swords used? Simply put, they were mainly used in conjunction, like I said before, with a large center grip round shield, and they were used predominantly in chopping actions and to chop at the legs because of their size and their weight. Now, if we put the Viking sword down for a moment and fast forward to the 14th, 16th century, you get the longsword. Now, the benefit of the longsword is not so much in its two-handed nature, but in the benefit of how it can be moved and utilized. As you can see, I'm moving this a lot easier than I moved the Viking sword. And the longsword's biggest advantage is its more nimble blade, but that comes from a better steel quality that arguably steel never got worse. It just kept getting better as we kept refining it more. We went from bloomery to crucible to modern day steel, which is still made in a crucible, but it's much better. Even the lowest grade of modern steel would have been magic back in the time period. Like this 50, like if they had 1055 in the medieval, if you were to take this sword back to the medieval era, they would basically call you a wizard. Because you must have enchanted the blade or something to get it to perform as it does. But yeah, the benefit of the longsword is within its nimble, quick nature, which arguably makes it favorable in terms compared to the Viking sword. Now, before anyone says anything, the Viking sword is only maybe an inch and a quarter shorter than this bastard sword or long sword. And honestly, this is on the shorter end of the spectrum for longsword blades, considering this is like a 34-inch blade, and generally longsword blades can reach a maximum of about 40 inches, 35 to 40 inches. So this is short. This is on the slightly shorter end of that spectrum, but still. The advantage of the longsword doesn't necessarily come from its two-handed grip, because you can grip a Viking sword two-handed as well. It won't be as comfortable as that, but you can do it. Where this shines is within its maneuverability and its versatility. I say versatility in the fact that you can comfortably and more effectively use two hands. It's not so much the double-edged, considering they both are double-edged. Now, another thing that, aside from the steel quality of the time period and the advancement of the steel quality, that makes the longsword more, I guess, prevalent in its use in terms of what we practice in the modern day, is what type of armaments were used in these periods. In the Vikings era, Vikings were going up against medieval, not so much medieval, Dark Age, 10th to 13th century, medieval period, basically. 14th century through 16th century was pretty much the Renaissance. During the 10th to 13th century, European knights were not clad in armor like you see in movies that make me want to jump into the world and go Super Saiyan on the directors, because why not? If they're not going to make it historically accurate, I might as well just go into that universe and go Super Saiyan and slash everyone to hell. But I digress. So, this sword would predominantly come up against, if you were a European knight or man-at-arms or even a more well-to-do foot soldier, this sword would only come up against gambesons and full-coat chainmail. And of course, other shield and sword combinations. So, this sword had to be more stout, heavier in the hand. It basically had to compensate for the protection that the shield grants. Argumentatively, full plate armor technically protects you more than a shield would, but at the same time, a shield is more maneuverable and often protects you more than plate armor. And what I mean by that is, if you have a slash coming at you from this and you block it with a shield, the shield is taking the brunt of that damage for you. You're just feeling the aftershock. If you get hit with this thing in the head and you're wearing and all you're wearing is a steel helmet, you're going to feel the blunt force of the attack plus the aftershock of it. So argumentatively, a shield protects you more than full plate armor because it protects you from the actual impact of the weapon and you just feel the aftershock of it hitting you. This, on the other hand, you're definitely feeling that shit whether you want to or not. There's no ifs, ands, or buts with this. You are feeling that impact whether you want it or not. But I digress. So, naturally this sword had to be designed in a way that it would have a broad tip capable of cutting through gambeson and or piercing its way through gambeson. And for those of you who don't know or haven't seen a lot of test videos of these things going through gambesons, gambeson isn't easy to get through. It's cloth armor. And people hear, oh, cloth armor, it must have been worthless. Why would they ever wear basically a winter jacket into battle? The reason is that though cloth, it's many layers of thick cloth. And the cloth was actually interchanged. So what that means is you'd have the linen going one way, the next layer would go the opposite way, and it would be like a layered quilt, basically. So as the blade cut into the gambeson, it would cut through one section of cloth going this way, and then all of a sudden it would have to make impact with a section of cloth going the opposite direction, which slowed down the blade, because now it had to cut into a section of cloth going in the completely opposite direction, and then it had to cut through the cloth going back into the same direction, and it kind of twists the edge. People don't realize just how clingy cloth can be to a blade. And even if I was to put a hair shaving edge on this sword, which granted it doesn't have a hair shaving edge, but it's sharp enough to do bottle cutting. If I was to put a hair shaving edge on this sword, and even try to slice my way through, say, a towel, or a few, like a bath towel, or a few shirts wadded up, this thing's not cutting all the way through it. Alright? But, again, blunt impact would transfer to the target anyways. It would probably pierce through it, if I was lucky. And here's another thing, those crisscrossing layers of cloth, again, also slows down a thrust. Because, as I said, the sword enters in through one layer going up and down, then it has to go through another layer going side to side, and then diagonal crossways, and all these different layers work together to slow down the blade the second it makes impact, whether it's a cut or a thrust. And then that's just gambeson alone. That's not even talking about the chainmail. And I know what you're going to say. Oh, I can thrust through chainmail easily. I'll just break apart the links. No, you're not. Properly forged, riveted chainmail. It's hard enough to get a hypodermic needle through some of the patterns of chainmail that are out there. Much less the whole fucking tip of a sword blade. And honestly, if I was going to have to thrust through chainmail, this would get through it a lot easier than this. And it comes down to tip geometry. Much more fine and acute, much broader and bolstered. Now, this one would actually survive better than the longsword, but still. And you're not cutting through chainmail. Granted, you can cut at chainmail and break some of the links if it's soft chainmail that hasn't been properly heat treated and tempered. You can break the links apart, maybe cut in like a very small sliver. Like hardened steel can cut into soft steel, but not in the way you think. Not cut directly through, cut into. There's a difference. Cut through? No. Cut into? Yes. But at the same time, it's not going to cut all the way through the chainmail no matter what you do. Now you probably think, oh Outlaw, if that was the case, how did people fight and how did they die? They had such superior armor. I never said it was impossible to thrust through chainmail with this thing. I never said it was impossible to cut all the way through Gambison with this thing. I said, and I quote, that it is not easy and you're not going to do it easy. Alright? It has been done. There's historical evidence of it been done. And if it wasn't done, we wouldn't have skeletal remains of people having their skulls split in half. Mainly, probably because they weren't wearing a helmet. But that's pretty much the Viking sword and what it had to go through. Synopsis: the Viking sword favors a hacking, chopping, and slashing style of combat with thrust thrown into the mix, and is best used against a shield, and the armors that it had to go up against were Gambison and chainmail and shield. Well, I should say the defenses it had to go up against. However, if we switch gears back to the longsword from the 14th century, 15th century, and 16th century had to go up against a completely different armor set. This is the emergence of the stereotypical medieval knight clad in shining armor. And even then, in the early 14th century, full plate armor was still very much an exclusively noble thing. Okay, you wouldn't find your common foot soldiers in full plate. Alright, despite what fantasy would tell you. You may find a man-at-arms or two in plate armor, but you're not going to find your common everyday soldier in it. You're probably asking, what's a man-at-arms? Basically, a man-at-arms is a hired mercenary that a king or a kingdom employs to bolster their ranks in a battle. And they're usually better well off because they're being paid for their services rather than forced to join because of a royal edict. So they would have more disposable income to buy somewhat better equipment. And usually, man-at-arms, they were more skilled than some of your average noblemen. Because a man-at-arms would pretty much make his living on the battlefield. So he would have more battle experience than most of your knights, actually. Depending on who the knight... Of course, that's all depending on who the knight is, who the knight family is, if his lord is in an actual battle or something. That's a hot topic and a debatable point. But what did the longsword basically evolve into? Well, the longsword evolved from the arming sword. As steel quality increased, blades got bigger. Okay, you went from arming sword to bastard sword to longsword, at least in terms of size. Arming sword, bastard sword, longsword, war sword, great sword. War sword is in between longsword and great sword, and that's another heated debate. But in any case, this is labeled as a bastard sword on Cold Steel's website, and it pretty much is. I would basically consider this a short longsword, but honestly, I actually like the blade length. I just wish the grip was about 2 inches longer. Because I like at least 4 inches of grip in between where my hands go. Without having to... With a European sword, I'd like at least 4 inches of grip between where my hands go without having to put my hand on the pommel. I'd do it anyways because that's just how I like to grip a European sword, but I like to be able to adjust my hands. That's basically how my sword style goes. I'll move my hands all over the damn grip. But in any case, what did the longsword have to contend with? The longsword had to contend with full plate armor. But that was, again, nearer the end of the Renaissance era, but I'm just going to say full plate armor, so I don't want to get into the whole time period thing. So it had to deal with full plate armor. It had to also, because gambeson did not fade out, neither did chainmail. They just became part of the full plate set. And I farted, but in any case, I'm going to continue. So basically, the full plate set would be gambeson with chainmail on top of that, and then full plate armor on top of that. You'd see the knights with the full plate, with the breastplate, the pauldrons, the arm guards, the greaves, the thigh guards, the metal skirt, and between all the joints of the armor that they could put it in was chainmail. Chainmail under the armpits, behind the legs, in between the legs, and then there was gambeson underneath that chainmail as well. Full plate armor is more like some full plate armors are more like putting on, like slipping on a hoodie actually, because they're actually sewn and riveted together to some degree. Also, you would have what is known as an arming doublet, which would just be your base gambeson with all the little ties and slips to hook your armor onto and secure it to your body. And honestly, this actually comes from the medieval era. They didn't really wash an arming doublet because it was just a pain in the little fucking ass to wash it. It was almost impossible to wash an arming doublet, so as far as I'm aware, they barely did it, if not rarely did it. But that's a subject for another day. The point is, the longsword takes advantage of the better steel quality of the Renaissance and was evolved to basically fight opponents in full plate armor to an extent. Now, you're probably wondering, Outlaw, what the hell are you talking about? Well, what I'm talking about is that the longsword, as you can see, has a very acute tip, and that was really meant for being able to thrust into the gaps of armor, mainly under the armpits and in between the legs. And there are major blood vessels and arteries underneath the arms in between the legs that if you were to cut or stab or thrust into would cause your opponent to bleed out. And there's always the ever popular... just a moment. Sorry about that. Had to take care of something. As I was saying, there's also the ever popular, like I demonstrated before, half sorting technique, which was used to get into those gaps in the armor. Now, since the longsword evolved in this era with better steel quality, and since it got bigger, it also now requires two hands. And the reason it can be two-handed is, as I said before, the full plate armor protects you. Especially if you can afford to get good quality steel plate, or even mid-quality steel plate. As long as it is full plate armor, it will protect you from any kind of cut. Thrusts are a different story, and that is also why they created anti-armor weapons such as maces, warhammers, halberds, poleaxes. These anti-armor weapons that were the mainstay of the battlefield that, as the name implies, was created solely for the purpose of getting through armor. However, you also had a sense of nobility with the longsword. Simply put, the longsword is, to quote Star Wars, a more elegant weapon for a more elegant age. What do I mean by that? Well, Renaissance era people believe that single-handed arming swords and Viking era swords like these were barbaric, basically. They believed that they were the weapons of the uncivilized, uncouth fighter. And that these new, longer, more elegant swords were the weapons of the noble and the gentleman. The longsword has actually been called a gentleman's blade, I believe, in some of the like treatises where it's mentioned, like a gentleman's sword, basically. I know that's more generally thought of as the rapier, but again, that was 17th century, 18th century. This is Renaissance era, is when the longsword really took its stand. And honestly, while there are techniques that utilize the two-handed nature of the longsword, like false edge cuts, Kronpau, and the such, and even like styles like Wrathguard, well, to be quite honest with you, Wrathguard, false edge cut, Kronpau, you can honestly perform the same techniques with this one-handed Viking sword that you can perform with the two-handed longsword. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, if you made it this far into this big-ass ramble, Outlaw, what is the point? Well, the point is, I just really wanted to make this video comparing and contrasting the uses of the longsword and the Viking era sword. Because this is actually going to lead into a new series I'm going to be doing, where I compare European sword to European sword. I know that's never been done before on the internet. We've never really seen a comparison between a Viking era, Viking style sword and a European Renaissance or late medieval era sword, because there is actually overlap into the 13th century. There are actually documented longswords being in the 13th century. I'm just kind of more broadly separating the two to medieval and Renaissance, even though these two did actually overlap at some point. But yeah. Now you're probably wondering, which would I pick? Honestly, longsword. And it's just because I'm much more accustomed to using, fighting, and or cutting with two-handed swords than I am with a single-handed sword. Also, this is just a bit lighter, so it has the maneuverability. I will be comparing and contrasting exactly how these were used. This was more like a historical thing rather than a whole like full-on comparison. Like I said, I got a lot of things planned for 2024. 2024 is basically going to be an upgrade in video quality. I'm also going to be kind of slowing down my uploads to majorly probably being maybe 2-3 shorts a week and maybe like one video a week, because I'm actually going to try to start doing editing, and editing takes time. So there may be times where you get 2-3 episodes of the Outlaw Samurai a week. There may be times where you only get one, but keep in mind that if I only upload one episode a week, it's because I've spent time editing that. This one will mainly just be like my standard editing process of just splicing the two halves of this video together, because I don't have the option to pause with this video camera like I do with my phone. Also, I don't know if it's just that I'm talking relatively softly as to not disturb anyone because it's like fucking 12 o'clock at night. Or that the mic is not as good as on my phone. I don't know. If you have sound problems, let me know, because if it is, I may have to ditch this camera until I can figure out a way to solve the audio issues. I may have to buy like a professional microphone or some shit, or go to Walmart and see if there's any microphones that will work with this thing. But yeah. So until next time, my noble band of outlaws, outlaw samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons. I'm out, peace, and look forward to actual cutting videos. There will be an actual cutting video, maybe when it warms up a bit, because apparently we're supposed to get a shit ton of snow sometime this week. So, look forward. The first ever European versus European sword comparison, as far as I'm aware. But until then, I'm out. Peace.